40 feet. That's not a typo. 40 feet of snow. In a single winter, snow so deep that a two-story building would be buried to its roof. Snow that fell so fast that a crew working on railroad tracks could be completely buried in less than an hour. And somewhere under that massive blanket of white, men were living, working, building a railroad through terrain that should have been impossible to cross in winter. This was the Sierra Nevada in the 1860s, and the Central Pacific Railroad was attempting something that many engineers said couldn't be done. They were building a railroad eastward from Sacramento, climbing 7,000 feet and 100 miles, crossing mountain passes that received more snow in a season than most places get in a decade. The snow didn't just slow the work, it stopped it completely for months at a time. It buried equipment, it killed workers, it threatened to bankrupt the entire project. But the Central Pacific had something no other railroad had attempted before. They had Chinese workers willing to live underground for an entire winter. They had engineers willing to design structures that had never been built before. Miles of wooden tunnels called snowsheds that would protect the tracks from avalanches and drifts. And they had a deadline. The Transcontinental Railroad was a race, and every day they weren't building meant the Union Pacific, coming from the east, was gaining ground and claiming more of the generous government subsidies that came with each mile of track. Could men really survive working under 40 feet of snow? Could they build structures strong enough to hold back avalanches that weighed thousands of tons? And could they do it fast enough to win a race against competitors who were building across flat prairie, while the Central Pacific was blasting through solid granite in conditions that would kill anyone who wasn't prepared? Before we get to how they did it, you need to understand what the Sierra Nevada winter was actually like. Because when we say 40 feet of snow, we're not talking about a freak storm. We're talking about the average annual snowfall in the high passes between 1866 and 1869. Donner Pass, where the railroad crossed the summit, regularly saw between 30 and 50 feet of snow between November and April. The record winter of 1867 to 68 saw 56 feet. That's not accumulated depth on the ground. That's total snowfall measured over the course of the season. The snow started falling in October and didn't stop until May. Some storms would dump 6 feet in 24 hours. The temperature would drop to 20 below zero at night. The wind would create drifts that could bury a locomotive, and the work couldn't stop. The Central Pacific had committed to building the railroad, and they were burning through money every day, paying workers, buying supplies, servicing loans. If the work stopped for 6 months every winter, the project would never be completed. The solution that emerged was both ingenious and desperate. During the summer of 1866, the Central Pacific had managed to lay about 20 miles of track through the lower elevations of the Sierra. But as they climbed higher, they encountered snow that didn't melt even in July. The engineers realized that if they were going to continue work through the winter, they needed to protect the workers and the tracks from the snow, not just clear it, protect against it. The concept of the snowshed came from an engineer named Arthur Brown, though the design was refined through brutal trial and error. A snowshed was essentially a covered bridge built over the railroad tracks. The structure consisted of heavy timber uprights driven into the ground on either side of the tracks, with massive horizontal beams spanning the gap. On top of those beams, they built a sloped roof angled at about 45 degrees. The idea was that snow would slide off the roof before it could accumulate enough weight to collapse the structure, and avalanches would hit the roof and deflect over the top, protecting the tracks underneath. Simple in concept, incredibly difficult in execution. Each snow shed required thousands of board feet of timber. The uprights were typically Douglas fir or ponderosa pine, 12 to 18 inches in diameter, set 8 to 10 feet apart. The horizontal beams were even larger. Some were 2 feet thick and 40 feet long. The roof boards were 3-inch planks laid side by side to create a solid surface. A single mile of snow shed required roughly 2 million board feet of timber and took a crew of 50 men about 3 months to build in good weather. The construction process was a marvel of organization and physical labor. First, the ground had to be prepared. In summer, that meant clearing the roadbed and leveling the surface. In winter, it meant digging down through snow to reach the ground, then using fires or hot water to thaw the frozen earth deep enough to set the uprights. The uprights had to go down at least 4 feet, preferably 6, to provide a stable foundation. Chinese workers would dig the holes using picks and shovels, working in teams of 4 or 5 per hole. Once a hole was ready, they'd maneuver the massive timber upright into position. This took 10 to 12 men working with ropes and pike poles, and then pack rocks and gravel around the base to lock it in place. The horizontal beams presented their own challenges. These timbers weighed anywhere from 800 to 1,500 pounds each. They had to be lifted into position on top of the uprights, secured with massive iron bolts, and aligned precisely so the structure would be level and square. The workers used a combination of ramps, block and tackle systems, and pure muscle to get these beams into place. A single beam might take a crew of 20 men half a day to position and secure. The roof construction was particularly dangerous. Workers had to climb up onto the partially completed structure, working 20 to 30 feet above the ground, handling heavy planks and timbers. They'd lay the roof boards across the beams, nailing them in place with foot-long spikes that had to be driven with sledgehammers. In winter, this work was done in conditions that made every movement precarious. Ice would form on the timbers overnight. Snow would accumulate on the partially completed roof. Men would slip. Some would catch themselves, some wouldn't. There are records of at least 15 Chinese workers who fell from snowsheds during construction and were killed by the impact or by being impaled on the structure below. But they weren't building in good weather. They were building through a Sierra winter. And that meant the Chinese workers, who made up roughly 90% of the Central Pacific labor force, had to work under conditions that would terrify most modern people. The Chinese workers had been recruited in San Francisco starting in 1865, initially in small numbers, then by the thousands, as the railroad realized they were the only labor force willing to do the work. Most were from Guangdong province in southern China. They'd come to California during the gold rush, or in the years after, and when the mines played out, they looked for other work. The railroad paid. Not well. Chinese workers made $1 a day compared to $1.35 for white workers. But it was steady work, and the Chinese crews had a reputation for being reliable. I'm skilled and willing to tackle jobs that other workers refused. The decision to keep building through the winter of 1866 to 67 was made in November when the first major storm hit. The Central Pacific had about 3,000 workers in the mountains, roughly 2,700 of whom were Chinese. The white workers, mostly supervisors and skilled tradesmen, wanted to head down to the valley for the winter. The Chinese workers said they'd stay if the company would provide shelter and keep paying them. The company agreed. And so began one of the most remarkable construction projects in American history, building a railroad under snow so deep that the workers lived and worked in a world of artificial tunnels and passages that existed entirely beneath the surface. The logistics were staggering. The workers couldn't live in tents. A tent would be buried under 10 feet of snow in a single storm. So they built wooden barracks partially underground, with reinforced roofs designed to shed snow. The barracks were crude, long rectangular structures with bunks along the walls, a central aisle, and wood stoves at each end for heat. A barracks might house 50 to 100 men. The air inside was thick with smoke from the stoves, heavy with the smell of damp wool, cooking rice, and the accumulated existence of too many men in too small a space. But the barracks were only part of the system. The workers also had to get from the barracks to the work sites. That meant tunneling through the snow. Not tunneling under the snow, tunneling through it. The Chinese crews would dig horizontal passages from the barracks to the railroad grade, shoring up the walls and ceiling with boards to prevent collapse. These passages were about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, just big enough for a man to walk through while carrying tools. Some of the passages extended for hundreds of yards. By midwinter, there was an entire network of tunnels and chambers beneath the snow, connecting barracks to work sites to supply depots, everything linked together in a subterranean maze that existed only for the winter and would melt away come spring. The creation and maintenance of this tunnel system was itself a massive undertaking. Snow isn't stable. It compresses under its own weight. It melts and refreezes. The tunnels required constant reinforcement and repair. Chinese workers, organized into dedicated maintenance gangs, would patrol the tunnel system daily, and looking for sections where the walls were starting to bulge inward or the ceiling was sagging. They'd add support timbers, dig out sections that were collapsing, reroute tunnels when the original path became unsafe. The air quality in the tunnels was terrible. You were in an enclosed space with limited ventilation. The air was cold and damp. When many men were moving through a tunnel at the same time, their breathing and body heat would create condensation that dripped from the ceiling and walls. The wooden support timbers would rot over the course of a winter from the constant moisture. By spring, many of the tunnel supports would be so deteriorated they'd have to be torn out and rebuilt if the system was going to be used the following year. Lighting in the tunnels was minimal and primitive. Like candles and oil lamps didn't work well in the damp air. Flames would sputter and go out. The Chinese workers used a type of oil lamp that had been adapted from designs used in Chinese mines, with a reservoir that kept the oil separate from the condensation. But even these lamps provided only a flickering, dim light that cast shadows and made the tunnels feel even more confined than they were. The psychological impact of living this way was significant. You'd wake up in the barracks, walk through tunnels to the worksite, work your shift, walk back through tunnels, eat, sleep, and repeat. Days would pass where you never saw daylight, never saw the sky. The only way you knew whether it was day or night was by the shift schedule. Some men handled this better than others. There are accounts, second-hand accounts from supervisors. Since the Chinese workers themselves left almost no written records, of men who became withdrawn, who stopped talking, who would sit in the barracks staring at nothing. What we'd now recognize as depression, or what we might call cabin fever. But in the 1860s, there was no vocabulary for mental health issues, no support systems. If you couldn't work, you didn't get paid. If you couldn't function, you were sent down the mountain when weather permitted. The sense of isolation was profound. These men were cut off from the outside world for months at a time. No mail got through, no visitors, no news from San Francisco or from China. They were living in a frozen bubble where the only reality was the work, the snow, and the constant awareness that an avalanche could end everything without warning. The work itself was relentless. The Chinese crews were divided into gangs of about 30 men, each gang assigned to a specific section of track or a specific snowshed. During a storm, they'd work in shifts around the clock, shoveling snow away from the structures, reinforcing roofs that were starting to sag under the weight, repairing damage from smaller avalanches. Between storms, they'd build, cutting timber, hauling beams, driving uprights into frozen ground with sledgehammers and mauls, raising the massive roof structures that would protect the tracks. The conditions were brutal in ways that are hard to convey. The temperature inside the snow tunnels stayed just above freezing because of the insulation provided by the snow itself. That sounds tolerable until you realize you're wet all the time. Melting snow dripped from the ceiling. Water seeped through the walls. Your clothes never dried. You'd work a 12-hour shift in damp wool that froze stiff when you stepped outside, then thawed again when you came back into the tunnel. Frostbite was common. Respiratory infections were constant, and there was no way out. Once the snow got deep enough, usually by late December, you were committed. You couldn't travel down the mountain even if you wanted to. You were there until spring. The food situation was better than you might expect, but only because the Central Pacific understood they needed to keep the workers alive and functional. Supplies came up the mountain by sled during breaks in the weather. For the Chinese workers, that meant rice, dried vegetables, tea, salted fish, and occasionally pork. So the Chinese crews had their own cooks who prepared food according to traditional methods. The white workers got beef, potatoes, bread, and coffee. Both groups got enough calories to sustain heavy labor in cold conditions, probably 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day per man. But the monotony was crushing. Same food every day for 6 months. No fresh fruit, no vegetables except what could be dried or preserved. But food and shelter weren't the real problems. The real problem was the avalanches. The Sierra Nevada is avalanche country. The combination of steep terrain, heavy snowfall, and variable weather creates perfect conditions for massive snowslides. In a typical winter, the mountains might see dozens of avalanches. In a heavy winter, hundreds. And the railroad was being built right through the avalanche zones. The warning signs were sometimes obvious. You'd hear a crack from upslope. You'd see a plume of snow dust rising above the ridge. You'd feel a vibration through the ground. When experienced workers heard or felt those signs, they'd run. Just drop whatever they were doing and run for the nearest protected area. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. The avalanche that hit Camp 14 in January 1867 killed 23 men. Camp 14 was one of the work camps near Donner Pass, housing about 150 Chinese workers. The camp was supposedly in a safe location, slightly below the main avalanche paths. But on January 18th, after 3 days of continuous heavy snow, an avalanche broke loose from a cornice about 2,000 feet above the camp. It came down the mountain at over 100 miles an hour, carrying thousands of tons of snow, ice, and debris. The workers in the camp had maybe 10 seconds of warning. Some ran. Most froze, unable to process what was happening. The avalanche hit the camp and buried it. Completely buried it. Barracks, supply sheds, equipment, everything disappeared under 30 to 40 feet of snow. The rescue effort began immediately, but it was hopeless from the start. The snow was too deep. The avalanche debris was too compact. Rescuers tried digging, but they were digging through snow that had been compressed by the force of the avalanche into something closer to ice. They used probes, long metal rods that they drive into the snow, hoping to hit something. They worked through the night and into the next day. They found 12 bodies. The other 11 were never recovered. They stayed buried under the snow until spring, when the thaw finally revealed them. The methodology of avalanche rescue in the 1860s was primitive by modern standards. There were no rescue beacons, no trained dogs, no organized protocols. When an avalanche hit, survivors would use whatever tools they had, shovels, picks, even their hands, to dig through the debris. The probes they used were made from tent poles or lengths of iron rod, anywhere from 6 to 12 feet long. You drive the probe down through the snow at regular intervals, hoping to hit something soft, a body, clothing, a pocket of air that might indicate a trapped survivor. When you hit something, you'd mark the spot and start digging. But digging through avalanche debris was backbreaking work. The snow was compressed under its own weight and under the force of the avalanche. It wasn't light and fluffy like fresh snow. It was dense and heavy, almost like digging through wet concrete. A man working at maximum effort might excavate a cubic yard of avalanche debris in 20 minutes. If a victim was buried 10 feet deep, you were looking at hours of work to reach them. By that point, they were almost certainly dead. The Camp 14 rescue went on for 3 days. The survivors dug, they probed. They found bodies one at a time and laid them out in a row on the snow. Some of the bodies were intact. Some had been crushed by logs or debris carried by the avalanche. Some had frozen solid in the time between burial and recovery. The Chinese workers, following their cultural traditions, I'd wanted to prepare the bodies for eventual return to China, but in the middle of a Sierra winter, the best they could do was wrap them in blankets and place them in a snow cache, essentially a pit dug into the snow and covered with boards to keep animals out. The bodies would stay there until spring, when they could be transported down the mountain. February 1867 saw another major avalanche near what's now called Yuba Gap. This one came down while a crew was working on a snow shed. The avalanche hit from the side, which they weren't expecting because the shed was supposed to protect them from upslope slides. But this one came across the ridge. 20 men were caught, 11 were killed instantly, crushed by the force of the snow. 9 were buried. The survivors dug frantically, working without tools. Using their hands to claw through the snow. They found 3 men alive, pulled them out. The other 6 suffocated before they could be reached. Then there was the March 1868 incident at Summit Camp, which killed 8 men in circumstances that were almost worse than a direct avalanche hit. A small slide, maybe 1,000 cubic yards of snow, came down during the night and blocked the entrance to one of the tunnel systems. The men inside the tunnels didn't know it had happened. They woke up in the morning, started their shift, began walking through the tunnels toward the work site. but the blocked entrance meant there was no airflow. The candles and lamps in the tunnels consumed the oxygen. Carbon monoxide from the lamps started to build up. The men at the front of the group realized something was wrong when they started feeling dizzy and short of breath. They turned around, tried to get everyone out, but by that point, the air was so bad that several men collapsed. The survivors managed to dig through the snow blocking the entrance and get everyone out, but 8 men died from oxygen deprivation and carbon monoxide poisoning. They'd been killed by snow without the snow ever touching them. The thing about avalanche victims is that most don't die from impact trauma. They die from suffocation. When you're buried in avalanche debris, the snow around you is dense and heavy. You can't move your arms, you can't expand your chest to breathe. If you're lucky and there's an air pocket near your face, you might have a few minutes. But avalanche debris is usually compressed right against your body. You take 1 breath, maybe 2, and then you can't inhale anymore. Your lungs are working against the weight of the snow. The carbon dioxide you exhale can't dissipate. It builds up in the small space around your face. You start to suffocate on your own exhalations. Most avalanche victims who are buried deeper than 3 feet are dead within 15 minutes. The psychological impact on the surviving workers must have been immense. You're working in an environment where a section of mountainside can break loose without warning and kill you along with everyone near you. You've watched friends disappear under the snow. You've helped dig out bodies that were crushed or frozen or suffocated, and then you go back to work because what else are you going to do? You're trapped under 40 feet of snow until spring. There's nowhere to go. So you pick up your tools and you keep building. The Central Pacific didn't keep detailed records of Chinese worker deaths. The numbers we have come from newspaper reports, testimony to the state legislature, and occasional mentions in company documents. The estimates range from 50 to 200 deaths over the winters of 1866 through 1869. Most were from avalanches. Some were from falls while working on the snowsheds. Some were from cold exposure or accidents with equipment. The bodies that could be recovered were buried in temporary graves near the work sites. In spring, when the snow melted, Chinese workers would collect the remains and send them back to San Francisco, where they could be processed for shipment back to China. It was important in Chinese culture that the bones be returned to their ancestral homeland. The railroad paid for this, not out of generosity, but because the Chinese workers had negotiated it as part of their employment terms. Among the few Chinese workers whose names we know is Ah Ling, who worked as a foreman overseeing one of the snowshed construction gangs. Ah Ling was unusual because he spoke English and served as an intermediary between the Chinese crews and the white supervisors. He's mentioned in several supervisor reports as being particularly skilled at organizing work and maintaining morale during the difficult winter months. Ah Ling survived the Sierra work and went on to work for the railroad for another 20 years, eventually becoming a maintenance supervisor. He died in San Francisco in 1892 at the age of 68. Another worker whose name survived in the records is Hung Hua, though we know him only because he was involved in an accident that resulted in an insurance claim. Hung Hua was working on a snowshed roof in January 1868 when he slipped on ice and fell 15 feet, landing on the railroad tracks below. He broke both legs and his left arm. The company doctor set the bones, but the injuries never healed properly. Hung Hua was unable to continue heavy labor and was reassigned to lighter work in the company cookhouse. He received no compensation beyond his continued employment at reduced wages. There was also Li Shaoqi, a young man who had immigrated from Guangdong province in 1864 at the age of 17. Li worked in the tunnels during the winter of 1867 to 68 and kept a diary, which is one of the very few first-hand accounts we have from a Chinese railroad worker. The diary was written in Chinese and wasn't translated into English until the 1960s. Li's entries described the daily routine, the cold, the fear of avalanches, and his longing to return home. One entry from February 1868 reads, in translation, "3 more men killed today by falling snow. We burned incense for them tonight. I wonder if I will see another spring." Li did survive and returned to China in 1870. His diary was preserved by his family and eventually donated to a historical society. But despite the deaths, despite the conditions, the work continued. By the spring of 1867, the Central Pacific had built over 10 miles of snowsheds and had laid track through sections of the Sierra that had been considered impossible to cross in winter. The snowsheds worked. They protected the tracks from avalanches. They allowed the railroad to keep operating through the winter instead of shutting down for 6 months every year. The engineering of the snowsheds was refined over time through brutal experience. Early versions were too light and collapsed under heavy snow loads. The engineers increased the size of the timbers and added support columns inside the sheds. They adjusted the roof pitch to find the optimal angle. Too shallow and snow would accumulate, too steep, and the structure became unstable in high winds. They added deflector walls on the upslope side of the sheds to redirect avalanches over the top of the structure instead of into it. By 1868, the Central Pacific was building snowsheds as fast as they could lay track in the high country. Some sections had continuous snowsheds for 2 or 3 miles, broken only by rock cuts where the terrain provided natural protection. A snowshed in cross-section looked like a massive A-frame built over the tracks, with the railroad bed running down the center and the roof sloping up on both sides. The interior was dark even in daylight because there were no windows. Windows would be weak points that snow could break through. Trains traveling through these sections would go from bright daylight into darkness, roll through miles of timber tunnel, and emerge back into daylight on the other side. The cost was staggering. The Central Pacific spent roughly $2 million on snowsheds between 1866 and 1869, equivalent to about $40 million in modern currency. That was money they had to borrow because the government subsidies only covered the base cost of track construction, not the additional structures needed to protect that track. But it was an investment that paid off. Without the snowsheds, the railroad couldn't have operated in winter. With them, trains could run year-round, generating revenue even during the heavy snow months. The workers who built the snowsheds developed specialized skills that were unique to this project. Chinese carpenters became experts in heavy timber construction, able to measure and cut massive beams with precision, able to assemble structures that could withstand tons of snow and the impact force of an avalanche. They developed techniques for working in extreme cold, how to prevent tools from becoming brittle and breaking, how to warm timber so it could be worked without cracking, how to secure structures on frozen ground. These skills had no application outside of this specific project. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, most of these workers scattered to other jobs that didn't use anything they'd learned in the Sierra. The completion of the railroad through the Sierra came in June 1868, when the last section of track over Donner Pass was finished. The Central Pacific had laid roughly 90 miles of track through mountains that rose 7,000 feet above sea level, through terrain that received more snow than almost anywhere in North America, in conditions that killed hundreds of workers. The Union Pacific, building from the east, that had laid over 500 miles of track across relatively flat prairie and desert in the same time period. But the government subsidies were based on difficulty as well as distance. The Central Pacific received $48,000 per mile for the mountain sections, 3 times what the Union Pacific got for their easy terrain. So in financial terms, the 90 miles through the Sierra were worth more than 200 miles of prairie track. But there was intense pressure to finish the Sierra section as quickly as possible because of how the subsidy system worked. The railroad that laid more total miles would receive more subsidies and would control more of the transcontinental route. Once the Central Pacific got through the Sierra and onto the flatter terrain of Nevada, they could build much faster. But every month they spent in the mountains was a month the Union Pacific was extending their line westward. The meeting point of the 2 railroads hadn't been established yet. It would eventually be Promontory Summit in Utah. But wherever they met, the company that got there with the most miles built would come out ahead financially. This competitive pressure is what drove the decision to keep working through the winters. The Central Pacific's management, led by Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, the Big Four who controlled the company, were willing to accept significant worker casualties if it meant they could keep building, while their competitors had to work around summer heat and supply problems on the prairie. The Big Four's calculation was cold and businesslike. Chinese workers could be replaced. Time and competitive advantage could not be. Charles Crocker, who supervised much of the actual construction, justified the winter work by arguing that the Chinese workers were uniquely suited to it. His reports to the other partners claimed that Chinese workers were more disciplined, more willing to follow orders, and more capable of enduring hardship than white workers would be. What he didn't say, but what was understood, was that Chinese workers had less legal recourse if they were injured or killed, they were paid less, and they had no political power that might lead to investigations or reforms. The speed of construction increased dramatically once the Central Pacific got through the Sierra. In the Nevada desert, working through the summer of 1868 and into 1869, Chinese crews laid track at a rate that shocked observers. The record day came on April 28, 1869, when a specially organized crew laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single 12-hour shift. That's roughly 1 mile every 72 minutes, including grading the roadbed, laying ties, setting rails, driving spikes, and ensuring everything was aligned properly. To accomplish this, the Central Pacific had over 1,000 Chinese workers organized into precisely coordinated teams, each team responsible for a specific task, all working in a synchronized rhythm that allowed them to move forward continuously. The race finally ended on May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific tracks met. The famous Golden Spike ceremony was attended by executives, government officials, and photographers. The Chinese workers who had built the Central Pacific Line were not invited to the ceremony and do not appear in any of the official photographs. They'd been sent to work on other sections of track or dismissed entirely now that the main line was complete. The snowsheds remained in use for decades. The original wooden structures were gradually replaced with more permanent designs, some built of stone, some of reinforced concrete, some of steel. But the basic concept remained the same. Even today, if you drive over Donner Pass on Interstate 80, you can see remnants of the old snowshed system. There are sections where the highway runs through modern snowsheds that follow the same route the railroad used. And if you know where to look, you can find ruins of the original wooden structures, collapsed and weathered, but still recognizable for what they were. The Chinese workers who survived the Sierra work dispersed after the railroad was completed. Some stayed with the railroad, working maintenance on the line they'd built. Some went to other construction projects, railroads in Nevada, irrigation systems in California, mining operations in Montana. Some returned to China, having saved enough money to go home. Most just faded into the historical background. We don't have their names. We don't have their stories in their own words. What we have are the structures they built and the vague references in company records to Chinese laborers who did the work that white workers wouldn't do. There's a memorial at Donner Pass now, erected in 2017, honoring the Chinese workers who built the railroad. It's a simple stone marker with a plaque that lists what's known about their contribution, but it's a small recognition for a massive achievement. Without the Chinese workers, the Central Pacific couldn't have built the railroad through the Sierra. The white workers didn't want to do the work, and there weren't enough of them anyway. The Chinese were the majority of the workforce, the ones who did the dangerous jobs, the ones who worked through the winter under 40 feet of snow, and they did it for $1 a day with no benefits, no insurance, and very little recognition. The economic impact of completing the Transcontinental Railroad was enormous. It connected the east and west coasts by rail for the first time. Travel that had taken 6 months by wagon or ship now took 6 days by train. Goods could be shipped coast to coast quickly and reliably. The California economy, which had been isolated and dependent on sea transport, suddenly had direct connection to eastern markets. Towns grew up along the railroad line. Industries expanded. The entire development of the American West was shaped by the existence of that railroad, but the human cost of building it through the Sierra was significant. The exact number of deaths will never be known because the records don't exist. The estimate of 50 to 200 Chinese deaths is probably low. It doesn't account for men who disappeared and were never reported, men who died from injuries or illness after leaving the work camps, men whose deaths were simply not recorded because nobody thought they were worth recording. The real number could be higher, could be much higher. And the snow sheds themselves became a source of danger in a different way once the railroad was operational. Fire. Miles of wooden structures, dried out by summer heat, filled with creosote and pitch from the timber. All it took was one spark from a locomotive smokestack, one hot cinder landing on the wooden roof, and the entire shed could go up. There were major fires in 1870, 1878, and 1889 that destroyed miles of snow sheds and required extensive rebuilding. The fires added to the cost of maintaining the railroad and eventually convinced the company to replace the wooden sheds with more fire-resistant materials. Today, the Sierra section of the original Transcontinental Railroad is still in use, operated by Union Pacific after a series of mergers and acquisitions. So modern locomotives pull freight trains through the same passes that Chinese workers blasted through solid granite. Modern snow removal equipment keeps the tracks clear using methods that would seem like magic to the men who built the line. But the basic route is the same. The challenges are the same. The snow still falls. The avalanches still happen. The difference is that we have machines to do the work that men once did by hand. The legacy of the Chinese workers who built the railroad through the Sierra is complicated. They accomplished something extraordinary. They worked in conditions that most people couldn't survive. They built structures that protected the railroad for generations, and they did it without recognition, without proper compensation, and without the basic respect that should have been their due. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, passed just 13 years after the railroad was completed, effectively banned Chinese immigration for 60 years. The country that had relied on Chinese labor to build one of its most important pieces of infrastructure turned around and said that Chinese people were no longer welcome. There's a bitter irony in that. The Transcontinental Railroad was celebrated as one of the great achievements of American engineering and determination. Presidents gave speeches about it, historians wrote about it, artists painted it. And for 100 years, the role of the Chinese workers was barely mentioned. The narrative was about American ingenuity, American perseverance, American triumph over nature. The thousands of Chinese men who did the actual work were reduced to footnotes or ignored entirely. That's changed somewhat in recent decades. Historians have worked to document the Chinese contribution. Museums have added exhibits about the Chinese railroad workers. The memorial at Donner Pass is part of that recognition, but it's recognition that came long after it mattered to the people who did the work. The Chinese workers who survived the Sierra winters and lived into old age died without ever receiving proper acknowledgement for what they'd accomplished. The snow sheds stand, or stood in the case of the original wooden structures, as monuments to what people can build when pushed to the limits of endurance. Miles of timber tunnels designed to protect a railroad from one of the harshest winter environments on Earth, built by hand, in winter, at altitude, under conditions that killed a significant percentage of the workforce. Built by people who had emigrated from China looking for opportunity and found themselves working under 40 feet of snow for $1 a day. If you drive over Donner Pass today, take a moment to think about what you're crossing. Not just mountains, not just a railroad route. You're crossing terrain where thousands of men lived underground for months at a time, where avalanches buried entire work camps, where the snow fell so deep that the surface of the earth disappeared, and all that remained was a white expanse broken only by the dark openings of tunnels, where men emerged to work before disappearing back into the snow. The workers are gone. The original snow sheds are mostly gone. The wooden barracks melted into the landscape when spring came and were never rebuilt. What remains is the railroad itself, still operating. She's still carrying freight and passengers through the Sierra. The trains that use it today run through modern tunnels and across bridges that have replaced some of the original structures. But the route is the same. The grades are the same. And if you know the history, you can look at the terrain and understand what it took to build a railroad through this place in winter, with hand tools and determination, when the snow was 40 feet deep and still falling.